It's been an amazing journey since Nionu and I were invited to do this together. For me, both scary and full of wonder as we've worked together to try to weave our stories together. And there have been these uncanny moments when we said, oh, your story is in my story, and my story is in yours. And from the beginning, I felt led to tell this story as a part of tonight. And when I told it to Nionu, she said, yes. This is one of the stories that I've told longer than any others. And it's been a huge teacher to me. It's a sacred story in my life. Once, long ago in Scotland, there was a forest called Cowterhog Wood. In it, the trees grew taller and the grass grew greener. And in the middle of that forest was a clearing. And in the middle of that clearing was a well, and round that well grew the most beautiful roses. But not very many people had seen these roses because it was said that Cowterhog was enchanted by the fairy folk. And if you were to go there, the fairy folk would capture you and demand from you a ransom. From some, they would demand gold or silver. From others, they would take their clothes. And it was said, if you were a maid, from you they would demand your maidenhood. Well, not far from Cowterhog, there was a lord who lived in a castle with his daughter, Janet. And Janet had grown up hearing these stories, but she was brave and she cared little for those stories. And so one day she braided up her hair and she lifted up her skirts and off she went to Cowterhog. She walked and she walked until she reached that clearing. And when she reached the clearing, she saw the well. And she walked over and she looked at the roses, and they were indeed the most beautiful she had ever seen. And she picked one. And when she did, a fairy knight appeared before her, and he looked at her, and he said, why pullest thou the rose, and why pluckest thou the wand, and why comes thou to Cowterhog without my command? But Janet stood her ground. She said, my father and my father's father have all owned this land. I can come where I wish. This is my place as much as anyone's. And Tam Lin looked at her and he said, oh no, my claim on this land is much older than yours. And you owe me a ransom. And he put his arms around her and he kissed her and he laid her in the grass. And she did not say him nay. Well, Janet went back to her house, and summer passed, and the fall came on, and it became clear that Janet was with child. And when her father noticed this, he said, Janet, who has done this to you? Which of the knights that sit at my table has made you pregnant? Tell me, and we will marry you to him. And Janet said, if I am with child, Father, myself I am to blame, and no man that sits around your table will give my babe his name. And as soon as she could, she braided up her hair, and she lifted up her skirts, and off she went to Couterhog. She walked and she walked until she reached the clearing. She walked right to the well and she picked a rose. And when she did, Tam Lin appeared before her. Janet told Tam Lin that she was pregnant and that her father wanted to marry her to one of his knights. She said, "What can we do?" Tam Lin looked at Janet and he said, "I was a man once, but one night I took a shortcut through Couterhog and the fairy folk, they captured me and pulled me from my horse. And when I awoke, I was in fairyland. It is very pleasant here, but if I were a man again, I would marry you." And Janet said, "Is there no way that we can make this so?" And Tam Lin said, "Yes, but it is very hard. Tonight is All Hallows Eve, and if you wait by Miles Cross and you wait there, the fairy people will come by on horses. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. Tam Lin said, "Oh, but you must do more. When you see me, I will be at the head of the last group of fairy knights on white horses, and I will have one hand gloved and one hand bare. And when you see me, you must reach up and grab me from my horse and hold me and pull me down. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. "Oh, but you must do more. When you hold me and pull me from the horse, the fairy people will turn me into many strange and horrible things, but you must hold me fast and fear me not. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. "Ah, but you must do more. At the last, they will turn me into a burning branch, and when they do, you must throw me into the water there by Miles Cross, and take your cloak and wrap it around me, and then the spell will be broken. Do you dare to do this?" "Aye," she said. Janet went back to the castle. And she waited for night to fall, and people in the castle gathered around fires and closed out the dark. But Janet, she braided up her hair and she lifted up her skirts, and off she marched to Miles Cross, and she hid herself there. And the dark night, it got darker, and she waited and she waited, and she eventually heard hoofbeats on the land. And she looked out and she saw a group of fairy knights on black horses. And she let them go by. It wasn't long till she heard hoofbeats like drums on the ground again, and she looked out, and there was a group of fairy knights on brown horses, and she let them also pass. She hid herself and waited, and then she heard hoofbeats again. She looked out, and there was a group of knights on milk-white steeds, and at their head was the fairy queen, and by her side was a fairy knight with one hand gloved and one hand bare. And when she saw Tam Lin, she ran to his horse and she pulled him from his horse. And when she did, there was a great outcry. The fairy folks screamed and they turned to him, and Janet held on. First, they turned him into a bear, and he was hairy and gruff. But Janet, she held on. Next, they turned him into a wolf, and he growled and he tried to bite her. But Janet held on. Next, they turned him into a hawk, and he squawked and tried to fly away. But still, Janet held on. Next, they turned him into a snake, and he hissed and wrapped around her and tried to strangle her. But Janet held on. Next, they turned him into a cold block of ice. And he was so cold that he burned her fingers, and she wanted to let go, but still she held on. And finally, they turned him into a burning branch. And when they did, she threw him into the water. And there he was, a naked man again. And Janet took her cloak and she wrapped it around him. And the spell was broken. The fairy queen came up to where Tam Lin was. She leaned down and she sang, "Had I but known, Tam Lin, a maid would ransom thee. I would have taken out thy 2 gray eyes and put in 2 eyes of tree. Had I but known, Tam Lin, before we left from home, I would have taken out thy heart of flesh and put in a heart of stone." With that, the fairy folk turned and rode off into the night. As I've told this story and as it's taught me, I've learned a lot about it. I've learned about the power of love, but I've also understood more what Kauterhog is. It's not the fairyland of our childhood that's playful and full of sprites. It's a very dangerous place. It's the place we go when we can no longer be human. When because of trauma or hurt, we can't feel anymore, and so our heart gets hard and we have to go away. It's the place we go when we are so sensitive that we have to hide our hearts and we might seek solace in addictions. I've also come to understand it as the place we go when we breathe in racism and white privilege, when we understand ourselves as not connected to all of humanity, not connected to all of our fellow brothers and sisters. It's the place we go when we cannot be human or we forget how to be.